To discuss this, I'm joined from Addis Ababa by Alfred Dube. He's the director of the Institute for Security Studies and also a former diplomat for Botswana. Martin Plaut is also with us, senior research fellow at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies at the University of London. Gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for joining us on the Newsmakers. Alfred Dube, is the African Union the best that Africa can do, or is it the best that Africa can hope for?
The African Union is the only continental intergovernmental organization. I think every member state hopes they can use it as a platform to achieve all their ambitions for African unity and African development. So the African Union as is now is what they hope they can build to achieve those strategies. But what it is, it's an organization of member states, and therefore it will achieve, its achievements will entirely depend on how its members can collaborate to achieve their goals.
Martin Plaut, is it an effective umbrella body for the continent, or do you feel its failings are greater than its achievements?
Well, I remember the hopes of the Organization of African Unity, which was its predecessor until 2001, from the 1970s, late 1960s onwards. And, you know, there was this great hope that it would unite Africa and bring about the sort of dream of Pan-Africanism that people like Kwame Nkrumah had put forward in that period. And quite frankly, it just hasn't done that. Now, that's not to suggest it hasn't done a lot. I mean, its first objective was to get rid of white minority rule in places like Rhodesia in South Africa, get rid of the Portuguese colonies in Mozambique and Angola. That it's certainly achieved. But the other aims, the Pan-African dream, the peace, the coordination, that I'm afraid it has not done.
Martin, I'm glad you mentioned Pan-Africanism. Ambassador Dube, how relevant is the concept of Pan-Africanism today in 2018? And indeed, is it a good thing?
I think Pan-Africanism was very relevant, as Martin says, at the time of fighting colonialism on this continent. It is still also an ambition that a number of Africans aspire to, simply because of the successes of that time. It brought Africans from all kinds of creeds and from various regions of the continent together to fight for one common cause. Now, our big common cause today is alleviation of poverty, peace and security on the continent. If we could have the same spirit of Pan-Africanism to tackle these very, very difficult issues today, which I have to say Africa has not really reached or even achieved the level of collaboration in that regard, which they should have done before. Then indeed, you know, if we could find the same spirit of Pan-Africanism to move towards that direction, we would be moving quite far. At this stage, I agree with Martin, we have not achieved very much in that regard. But as a slogan, as a hope for Africa, I think Pan-Africanism still has a meaning in our development, in our political development, in peace and security.
Martin, if it's peace and security and alleviating poverty, which are the aims, the new chairman of the African Union, Paul Kagame, he wants to introduce some pretty radical reforms. Are any of those reforms designed specifically to address those two issues?
Well, one of the things he's put forward is that Africa should stand on its own feet. For example, he said there should be a 0.2% tax on imports from outside Africa so that Africa can finance itself. I mean, it's one of the great ironies that Africa, which has huge riches and whose leaders, and here I do not include Botswana, Ambassador Dube's country in this, you know, some of whose leaders have salted away hundreds of millions of dollars in Swiss bank accounts and the Cayman Islands and God knows where. You know, really Africa has to first stand on its own 2 feet and unite. And, you know, there are all sorts of things it can do. I mean, for example, if there was a cut in the many, many tariffs and border controls that are put up all across the continent to prevent, say, a Ghanaian exporting to Nigeria. I mean, how many roadblocks do they have to go through? It's appalling. Now, Southern Africa has done quite a good job in this respect. But, parts of West Africa, Central Africa are just atrocious. And there's a long, long way to go in this respect. But, Africa has made a lot of progress, but, there's just such a long way to go still.
Ambassador Dube, if it's so obvious to a neutral observer, albeit an extremely seasoned observer and analyst like Martin Plaut, why is it not obvious to the leaders of Africa that this is just one of the issues that they need to address, breaking down those tariff barriers?
Well, Martin is quite right. This is really a task that every African leader should really aspire to, because until we break those barriers, Agenda 2063, which is adopted a few years ago by the same heads of government, cannot be achieved. We have to break those barriers. We have to understand that global trade and the flow of financial flows is a reality in the world. You cannot be isolated in the African continent away from the rest of the world. We cannot be isolated from each other. It really cannot work anymore. If you are in the ECOWAS region, you should be able to move seamlessly, certainly in terms of movement of goods, without too many customs barriers and controls that make it so difficult to do so. But it's the same whether you're in the south or the west or the east. Africa must move towards that goal. I agree completely.
Okay, let's imagine in an ideal world, in a fantasy land, that all of Africa, the entire continent, is a free trade area. If corruption exists at the level that it does today, surely that would just negate every advantage that such a fantasy world of free trade would provide. You guys know the figures yourselves, but the viewers may not know them. The Economic Commission for Africa says that every year the continent loses more than $148 billion because of various corrupt activities. The AU Commission chairperson opened the AU summit in Addis Ababa by saying the year 2018 is called to be the year of the battle against corruption, and crucial decisions will be taken here at the summit, whose highlight is institutional reform. Is it really going to happen? The rest of the world looks at Africa, and one of the first words it thinks of is corruption. Ambassador?
Well, corruption on this continent, and indeed, of course, corruption around the world, is one of the biggest challenges. Yes, you have this year, the African Union at this summit adopted the theme of fighting corruption. We all know what is happening on the ground. You've just referred to it yourself, and the cost of corruption on this continent. It's massive. It is not, I think it's a hope that we can collectively fight corruption, but really corruption starts from the domestic before you even get in the regional area rather than before you even get to the continent. But it is not going to be easy. There must be no illusions that we can eradicate or even fight corruption 20% in the next 2 years or 5 years. So that is, I think, again, another wish, another aim, because we all believe, I think we all understand that corruption has really sucked the energy and the effectiveness of our governance and our institutions just through corruption. It's cost us a hell of a lot. And it is time that Africa, our leaders, begin to really understand that without, again, tackling corruption at whatever level, this continent, all our hopes and our dreams will be sacrificed at the altar of corruption.
Noble words, Ambassador. Martin, what about concrete action against corruption?
I mean, that's what's required. And one of the problems is that the people who are sitting around that table are themselves, shall we say, have less than clean hands. I mean, you get someone like Emmerson Mnangagwa, the new president of Zimbabwe. I mean, he was named in a United Nations report of having been part of a syndicate that took billions out of the Congo during the Congo War. and that he then established a syndicate inside Zimbabwe. Now, I mean, you know, he has to answer the questions about those. You have people like President Zuma in South Africa, again, named in over, 400 more cases against him in South Africa. How can you expect people like that to implement an anti-corruption drive when they themselves are facing the issues? But, you know, I don't want to just sort of bang on about Africa and corruption. There's much more to Africa than that, many positive things coming. And the other thing that one has to never forget is that it takes two to tango. It takes the Western countries which are involved in quite a lot of the corruption, some of which is sanctioned by states, and, you know, a lot of the tax havens are run, for example, from Britain. So, I mean, you know, that is where the money is hidden away. You know, there are all sorts of people who have dirty hands, and, you know, really they have to, shall we say, step up to the plate. Africa has the right to call on the international community to support its efforts. That is absolutely legitimate. But at the end of the day, it's Africa that must solve this problem.
How does Africa solve the problem, if indeed it's a problem, of longevity of service? The longer generally a leader will be in power, it doesn't matter where you are in the world, systems of patronage become entrenched, and the elite that benefits from that leader's patronage, they have a self-interest in maintaining the status quo. Let me again, for the benefit of the viewers, give you a few leaders around Africa and how long they've been in power. Biya in Cameroon, 42 years. Nguesso in Republic of Congo, 33 years. Museveni in Uganda, 32 years. Al-Bashir in Sudan, 28 years. Deby in Chad, 27 years. Afwerki in Eritrea, 26 years. Kagame in Rwanda, 23 years. That can't be a good thing. Martin?
Well, I agree. I mean, you know, the greatest present that President Mandela gave to South Africa was saying after the end of one term, and he was a stellar leader, he said, I've done my bit, I'm retiring. It was the greatest present because nobody can ever now turn around in South Africa and say, well, you know, you really need me, you can't get by without me. These people should hand over. And, you know, you mentioned Museveni in Uganda. I was in Uganda a few days after he took power. And I remember him saying that the African Union, or the Organization of African Unity, as it was then called, was a club of dictators. Well, he's certainly joined the club.
Ambassador, what do you feel about longevity of service? Does it suppress true democracy? Is it a problem for Africa that many of these leaders simply don't leave?
Oh, it is a problem. It is a major problem. You cannot, I just cannot understand how, first of all, it's hard enough having 2 terms running a country as a leader. You know, to be 40 years at the helm of a country with very little change in terms of the kind of leadership or support, the kind of cabinet, your senior officials with very little change, because what it breeds, what actually longevity breeds is also you have the same people over and over again, even well beyond the age of 60, because those are the people you trust, those are the people you control. Longevity of governance, I mean, that kind of governance, that kind of leadership cannot be good for Africa at all.
Martin, you mentioned financing. Sorry for interrupting you, Ambassador. Martin, you mentioned financing. The AU wants to finance itself. Is that realistic? There are some countries who say, look, we make up so much of Africa's overall GDP. If you give a particular percentage to every member state that it has to contribute, we, those richer nations, will have to contribute too much. There could be a problem there.
Well, it could be a problem, but, you know, at the end of the day, Africa has many resources. You know, you can't go relying on other people forever. I mean, I don't know if you saw the story today that the African Union is in a building which was built for it kindly by the Chinese. And today it's been revealed, guess what they did? They put bugging devices inside so that all the communications of the African Union are transmitted back to China. Well, that's what happens when you get gifts. But, you know, I think it's a pity that we always bang on about the bad things about Africa. Africa has a young and dynamic group of people, particularly the young businessmen whom I've met up and down the continent, who are bringing new life and vigor to the continent and have fantastic ideas and who know exactly what the problems are, but they are determined to make a success of their countries and a success of the continent. And I have absolutely no doubt that in due course, Africa will be one of the shining lights of the world. I remember very well when China was written off as a basket case. Who would do that today?
Sure, and I must say that China does deny those allegations of bugging the AU's head offices, Martin. Ambassador, let's end with you. The African Union has asked President Donald Trump for an apology after he used foul language to describe Africa as a continent and the individual countries that make up Africa. Do you think that the African Union will get an apology that it wants? And if it doesn't, does it matter, really?
Well, I think, I believe very strongly that President Trump, as the leader of as the leader of the United States, a superpower, should not be at all, whatever what may have got to him, can never use language like that to talk about other countries and the very countries which are of particular importance even to the United States. He must apologize. He can say he didn't say it. He can refuse to apologize, but he must understand that by saying what he said, he's, in our eyes, in the eyes of Africans, young and old, he cannot be a friend. The United States has a responsibility as a global power. The President of the United States holds that responsibility. And he cannot just think he can say such insulting words and it's nothing to Africa, or even to the world for that matter. I mean, it's not even for Africans only. I think President Trump should step up to the plate. He should be brave enough to stand up, face us and say, guys, I made a mistake, I'm sorry. That's what he should do.
Ambassador Alfred Dube and Martin Plaut, thank you for joining us on the Newsmakers.